Buenas tardes. Good. My name is Davila Caballero. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. It's a global law firm with 16 offices across the world. And I also have a different hat, which relates to today's talk, which is I'm the president of an organization that's called the Association of Law Firm Diversity Professionals. So people that have that role, the similar role that I have at my firm across the US, and that, trust me, we'll talk a little bit later about that, is a positive step in the profession, which means firms now have designated professionals to ensure that their organizations are inclusive and that everyone is given the equal opportunity to succeed. So I'm going to step back in the mic, so don't worry. I actually brought visuals. Mine is a little different. By show of hands, I saw who is applying or in the process of thinking of law school, but how many law students are present? Actual law students. Okay, so the majority of you are certainly in the pipeline, so I'll reserve more time for that, for those comments. I'm just going to share my story, and you're going to have to suspend a lot of realities, particularly in time. So pretend that this is my social media presence, so to speak. And every story has a beginning. And I've been blessed that I had a terrific beginning, I think. I was born in the small town of Santurce, Puerto Rico. And you might have heard of this island because now it's being called an island surrounded by water. A big ocean water. I'm paraphrasing. And I'll park that because we're going to come back to that quote in a second. But here's a photograph of my hometown circa 1971. And I'm truly blessed because there's a lot of rich cultures that make up the Puerto Rican community. And I'll also share how that comes into play with my own storyline. All right, so let's get personal. There's my nuclear family at the beginning. And I'm going to start with those strong women that are in the background. The woman that's a little bit younger is my mother, Rafaela Caballero Pagan, and she was known to everyone as Doña Rafi. And Doña Rafi, her life, she's an exceptional woman and individual. Her life took a big detour when she was in college. She fell in love, got married, started a family, and dropped out of college to raise her family, which included yours truly. By the time that I was born, circumstances were different, and she found herself as a single mother, having dropped out of college with 3 kids. This is not an uncommon story, unfortunately, for many communities and families of color. I'm sure many of you can relate to that story. And her success in raising us would have not happened without the help of the other strong woman next to her, which is my abuela, which also very common in communities of color. There's another woman next to the other powerful woman, cross-generational, making things happen. So my mother defeated the odds and got herself back in college, finished her undergraduate degree, proceeded to get a graduate degree, and ended up being a faculty professor. At the same time as raising all the 3 of us, again with the help of abuela, which Maria de la Paz Caballero Pagan, everyone called her Doña Pasi, a beautiful name for those of you not familiar with or not fluent in Spanish, which means Mary of the Peace, and known as, again to everyone, Doña Pasi. The 2 siblings at the extremes, there are 3 boys in front. I'm the third of 3. I'm in the middle with the arms tucked right in the middle. Tells you a lot about that. Notice that the bow tie is a theme that I picked up early in my childhood, and I attribute also my sense of style to those 2 women. And I'll skip a lot of the stuff of my life in Puerto Rico and fast forward to the next part of the journey, which was choosing my college, and I ended up in Orlando, Florida. I'm part of the early stages of diaspora from the island of Puerto Rico to the U.S. mainland. The big diaspora for us as a community first happened during the Depression, and it started most notably in New York. The next big wave started to go into the late 80s and 90s through various recessions and difficulties in the island, and Florida was a very appealing location, but we didn't go straight to Miami or the southern part of Florida. For some reason, the magical kingdom drew a lot of Puerto Ricans to Central Florida. And believe it or not, when I arrived in 1990, I started to find out that I was a Latino. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. That sounds weird. But when you grow up in an island where everyone's Puerto Rican, or perhaps from Cuban ancestry or Dominican ancestry or other islands, you're all kind of like the same. You're in the Caribbean. And this notion of other identities started to play out here where I find myself in 1990. Believe it or not, there were still a lot of orange groves in Central Florida, Waffle Houses everywhere near the campus. It wasn't as big as it is now, and we were still the two Latino families within the radius, and my younger siblings that were not featured in the photograph, they were the only Puerto Rican family in their high school, which is, I dare to say, that's the opposite now. Like, there's probably one Anglo family, and the rest are, if not Puerto Rican, they're predominantly Latino communities. The next big decision after going to UCF was, where do I go next? I knew at UCF that I wanted to pursue the law, and by way of background, when I arrived at UCF, I wasn't certain about my major. I was forced to take an economics class as part of my general education. I had never learned about the concept of economics or how that worked or what it actually meant. For some reason that was skipped in the island teachings, but lo and behold, it was love at first sight. Completed my degree in economics, but with the intent that I would pursue the law. The bigger question was, where should I do it? At that time, believe it or not, there was no such thing as the World Wide Web, or what you call the internet. There were no social media, and in my mind, in my fictional mind, where I saw myself was going to law school in Boston. I won't name the schools, they're all fantastic, but that's what I had in my mind. That's what every aspiring, at least Puerto Rican, wanted to be if you wanted to pursue law. So that's what I worked throughout my entire college career. Now, you know my background now a little bit better. That, by the way, is not a photograph of Boston. That's deceiving. That is actually in Brooklyn, New York, but it represented the storyline quite well, which is when I first visited Boston, having been accepted to multiple schools in that area, I arrived in May and I was welcomed by 17 inches of snow. And as a good Puerto Rican, I had never seen snow in my life. And that was a little traumatic when it kept pouring and it kept coming. At first it was cute and I was playing with it. Then I realized I don't even have a jacket, gloves, or anything. I'm in jeans and a suede jacket, which is what I thought would be more than plenty, and I was clearly wrong. And I just visiting the schools was having a difficult time envisioning myself as part of those communities, both in the law school and outside of the law school, despite the amazing pedigrees and amazing faculty and all the other offerings that those law schools offered. So it really messed with my mind, because I had worked so hard and diligently, and I knew the stakes were high, not only for me, but for many people in the family. And I took a year off. I actually wanted to think real hard. I stayed in Orlando, Florida for an extra year. I did, yes, I checked off the box of working in a theme park, did SeaWorld, I'm sorry, we'll talk about that later. But I also worked in the healthcare industry for a year using my economics degree, but still determined to go to law school, just didn't know where. Good thing, I happened to come across the university called Tulane. I had never heard of that university, believe it or not. It was suggested to me by a great mentor, and that mentor was my older brother featured in one of the bow ties earlier on in the picture. He had started and chosen his law school at Puerto Rico, so he stayed, and he's a little bit older than I am, and he was a third-year law student in Puerto Rico. And he mentioned, look, I know you're struggling with that decision, did you consider Tulane? And I said, I've never heard of that school. And he said, you should take a look at it. It's in New Orleans, and they have what is called a civil code. So it's the only jurisdiction in the United States that is founded in a civil code legal system comparable to many of the countries in Europe. So it's a predominant legal system. And that's the same body of law that applies to Puerto Rico. He said, I know you don't want to come back to this little island and you're too cool for us now, but should you have to come back as a lawyer and you go to Tulane, there's a big network, it is well regarded, and you can definitely practice law thereafter, so you should consider it. I trust his advice to this day. I visited the school, fell in love with the school, fell in love with the community. It gave a lot of options of whether environmental law, international law, the faculty, the administration. It just was a great opportunity, and I decided to turn down the offers at the schools in Boston, many of which, actually all of which, were ranked higher. Now, I'm not saying that's always the right decision. I know it was the right decision for me to enroll at Tulane and the journey it provided. As a comical Mother Nature irony, I actually got to see snow in New Orleans while I was living there. It does happen, it's rare, but so I also learned that don't make a decision based on weather. That changes, as the seasons have Nikki alluded. And I enjoyed my time at Tulane. I focused all of my studies in international law, had spent my summers in Europe doing international law. The big question was whether I wanted to practice in the private side or the public side. That was the new struggle. There's always a challenge, a decision. How do I shape my career? Ultimately, I looked inwards and realized and came to the realization, I want to do public international law. I had done private, and there was always a struggle in that environment for me, at least in that moment in time. And I ultimately decided to pursue public international law. So after I graduated, I packed up my bags from New Orleans, drove to Washington, D.C., and became a legal officer at the Organization of American States, a large multilateral organization. View it, for those of you that are not familiar, like a mini United Nations, but for all the countries in the Western Hemisphere, excluding Cuba. You can know, not to get into politics, but that's the only country not represented or with active representation. So OAS was an amazing launch to my career. It was often described as the dream job that many lawyers aspire to have, and it was so rare to start your career in an organization or with a position like that, as I came to discover. As you contemplate your decisions of where you go to school, what you focus, again, you've heard it over and over, you have to listen to yourself. If you are honest with yourself, you will make better decisions. Those decisions will allow you to be successful, and being successful is what allows these opportunities to surface. Yes, there's some luck, but a lot of it is grit, and we'll talk a little bit about that word later on. So that's where I started my career. Then I took a tour. For 6 years, I practiced law. Life changes, new seasons arrived. I left DC and moved to New York to practice. I went into big law. Wow, Nikki, that was a different world. Different world. It was my first exposure to that structure of a large global law firm anchored in New York with thousands of lawyers, still relatively junior in the profession, getting my bearings. I will say it reminded me what the students shared, never give up, because you show up to work and you're just trying to survive. It really feels like you're just trying to get everything done, learn as much as you can, be mentored, develop relationships, but it was a challenge to learn the demands, particularly with the polar opposite of having worked in a public international practice, which is what I had done, and switched that into the private setting. Another season arrived, and I ended up in San Diego, California. And there I became a lawyer for a small employment litigation firm. Now, do not ask me if I took employment law in my law school career. Actually, do not ask me if I was a member of moot court, or if I even did TRILAC. I'm not advising you to not do any of these things. I'm simply saying that your career as a lawyer will change, or can change. Nikki mentioned she's a unicorn. Most of us have multiple careers in multiple settings, and we're drawing from what we learn in law school and then apply it to the organizations that we find and how we contribute that value, and we're always like a chameleon, changing and drawing from that a set of analytical skills. And after being in San Diego for a couple of years, that's when the aha moment crystallized and said, you know, I love the law, I love practicing law, but what really calls me is to do diversity work. To really, after having experienced both the benefits and being the beneficiary of pipelines and having amazing mentors to invest in my professional development, I wanted to do the same, but I was a little selfish. I wanted to get paid for it. And I started to discover that the legal profession was undergoing a new change, which was creating positions for individuals who wanted to devote their skill sets into changing or organizational change to broaden and diversify the profession. So I moved back to New Orleans, took a position at my alma mater as Assistant Dean of Diversity at the law school. I was also the Assistant Dean of Career Development, so I know a lot about not only the application process, but also the out product of securing jobs. During my 8 years at Tulane Law School, I read over 8,000 applications, admitted hundreds of incoming students. Each class had roughly 300 students, just to give you an idea of the volume. So I'm certainly, if you want to flag me about personal statements, what deans look for, what to avoid, I'm happy to share that expertise. But I found myself back in what I started to call my hometown in the mainland of New Orleans, working in academia. And once I left New York, by the way, I had told myself two things. I will never live in New York ever again, and I will never go into big law practice. Clearly you know where this is headed. Never say never. Why? Because I ended up back in New York. I took a position after 8 years at Tulane at the current firm where I'm at Cleary Gottlieb, which is very well known not only in the legal profession for the quality of its work, but also as a pioneer in diversifying the profession. To give you a little taste of how we were approaching inclusion differently, when the firm was founded in 1946, which was not that long ago. There are a lot of other firms that started earlier than us, so we're not the oldest by far. We started in New York and DC simultaneously, and there were 9 associates, so 9 young lawyers, view it that way, and 1 out of those 9 was a woman. So Julianne mentioned some of those statistics that are currently on the ground. Imagine 1946, what those statistics look like, and the fact that in 1946, we started our firm with a woman as an associate. It doesn't sound like an amazing number, but let me give you another context. there's a school that I will name, Harvard Law School, did not start admitting women until 1950. So if they weren't even admitting women into law school, the fact that we started our firm with women on our payroll tells you that we were already thinking differently about the practice of law and looking at talent for exactly that, talent, not by race, gender, ethnicity. And then we started to branch out and ask ourselves, abilities, sexual orientation, and all the other potentially demographics that could become exclusionary. So that's where I'm at the law firm of Cleary Gottlieb. And you know what happened? This is, I'll just quickly say that it's very important as you practice and think of law to never forget who you are, you've heard that, but also to really keep your anchors and to know who you are as an individual and what drives you, what motivates you, what wakes you up, what fills your heart and your soul. And for me, it's my family, my communities, and yes, my dog, who is the one that puts up with me, and you can even say their dogs are so loyal, I love them, but they can judge you too. They're like rolling their eye like, oh, please, another selfie. That is an actual selfie, so that, now we're back up to speed. But let's go back in time again, and let me, if you indulge me, let's look at my life and through the diversity and inclusion lens. So I said that we started in Puerto Rico, and that's where the journey began. And as I mentioned, I noticed early on that there were subtle differences in the way that we did treat each other in the island. Whether it was by the color of our skin, how white I am versus my brother who's a little bit darker, and how we're treated based on that pigmentation. By the schools that you went to. Again, a working mom of three could not afford any of the elite schools. So even to this day, I'm encountered with the question, where did you go to high school? Because that allows some people to understand where you belong, where they think you belong in society. So that was the first lesson. When I talk about strong women, it's fascinating to me because what I was really learning in life was about gender equity and parity, which is what Julianne was addressing. Why is it still so difficult for law firms to recognize the talent and contributions of our female colleagues? Why is that? For decades we've been admitting women at the same level in the law school, we've been onboarding them successfully in law firms, yet we continuously dismiss their talents and contributions, even despite any business rationale, which tells you that there's something wrong in the system. And when I look back at my life and recognize that I'm such a passionate and advocate for gender equity and parity, it started there. Because the role models that I had allowed me to draw from those experiences. And I remember my own mother fighting within academia in a time where she was one of the few female professors and trying to find her voice and earn her seat at the table in the Senate and other leadership positions within the academic ranks. When I look back at my time at UCF, I alluded to this, I discovered that through the US mainland prism, I am seen as often the brown Latino. I am so happy to be in Miami because I can say my name, Carlos Davila Caballero, and nobody looks at me like, I can't even look at you or say, everyone's like, oh yeah, Davila Caballero, awesome. Trust me, in New York, day in, day out, I come in and it's like, it's a hyphenated name, D-A, V as in Victor, I, and anyhow. So I discovered through this moment in time that I was perhaps part of this amazing community, but that was facing very different challenges that others in the community did not face. So it was a really interesting development that has carried on through even this present stage of my story. When I look at my goals of going to Boston, what I did not understand at that time and now is so clear to me is like, I felt like an outsider in Boston. And that's why I could not see myself enrolling in schools. So going back to you and your stories, when you look at the schools that you're selecting, think about that. Be honest about who you are, and do you have that sense of belonging? And for me, I didn't feel as an insider until I went to Tulane. And I knew, we all know what that feels like, when you feel like you're part of the group, when you know that people want you present, and you know when they don't. And that's what we're trying to do in our roles as diversity professionals. Everyone that comes in through the doors of Cleary Gottlieb should feel like they belong, that they're valued, that their voices are going to be heard, their contributions recognized, and more importantly, their careers can progress. When I look back at the OAS, as amazing as that experience was, there was a very high opportunity cost. Huge one. I was still in the closet. I could not be authentic in that job. It's gotten better, but sadly the organization was extremely homophobic. So my significant other at the time had to be referred to under the code name as Jessica. And I was always struggling to not trip myself to say the actual name of my significant other at that time. And you cannot succeed in life, I'll repeat, you cannot succeed in life if you're covering. You're spending a lot of energy, and research now proves this. For every ounce that you're trying to hide, minimize, create a compartment for something that is inherent, an inherent part of who you are, you cannot be successful because you're wasting that energy. So the big question is, would I do the same thing over again? For me, the answer is no. But now it's hindsight. Things have changed, so hopefully you will find that you have more opportunities and that none of you will have to make those hard decisions to cover or to pass. So I really encourage you, if you're not familiar with these terms, to look at the work and the research from Kenji Yoshino at the NYU Law School, who's amazing and exceptional at the distinction between those two. The world tour, or the US tour that I mentioned, I already alluded to the authenticity. It wasn't until I left the OAS that I started to bring 100% of Carlos to every job that I had. And because of that, that's when my career started to progress. That's when I started to achieve the level of success and contributions that I envisioned in my mind. And I started to employ and leverage that. So once I arrived to San Diego, one of the first things that I did, I was actively involved both in the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and also with the LGBT legal community. And both of those created just amazing networks that allowed for my career to further blossom. And that same authenticity is what led me back to my position at Tulane. You heard it from the students, these networks all across. When I was a law student, my contracts professor, the fall of my first year, was a visiting professor. We developed a great relationship. He invested in my growth. I invested in our relationship as a mentee-mentor role. Years later, that visiting professor ended up as dean of the law school, who was then a friend and a mentor, and who presented me the opportunity to transition from a practitioner into a diversity professional. So every single time, this moment in time that you're here, the networks that you create are really creating opportunities for you further down the line. When I look at now the present in the moment in time that I am, I've alluded to the seat at the table. That's so powerful. When I heard Andrew speak of how he uses his seat in front of you and talk about the work that he's doing in disability, I was really empowered. I felt almost like an underachiever. I'm like, I too graduated from UCF and I did nothing of the work that he did thereafter. So he's already like 10 years ahead of me in leveraging his skill sets. But that's what you are seeking. Every single moment in time in Nikki's seasons of life, you can decide to occupy a seat or not. you can take advantage of that seat or not. And in the famous words of Carla Harris, the most important decisions about your career, and your career includes law school career, and your professional legal career, will happen when you're not in the room. They will. So how is it that, what is the message, what is the brand, and what is your reputation? So when you walk out, when you leave that seat of power, imagine, I'm going to use Andrew as the example. What are you thinking about Andrew? What would you say if you had to share someone, oh, I heard Andrew speaking on his work? And that's how people will start to address and relate to you, be it as a first-year law student in your contributions and your interactions with the faculty, with the administrators. Nikki mentioned everyone that you encounter. That is a moment in time. So the seat can be literally that seat, or it could be figuratively in the space that you occupy in your circles. And going back to those anchors that I referenced earlier on, not only are they your anchors and your internal compass, but they're also an acknowledgement to the privilege that you have. Anyone that completes law school has earned an amazing privilege and distinction, and as you've heard the cliche, with that comes a lot of responsibility. And you should really focus and endeavor to utilize all of the privilege that you've been given, 100% of that privilege, and really deploy it to having or creating better lives around you. I said I would part the statement about how my island is being described, and it's really difficult to see paper towels being tossed and comments to question the cost of saving lives. So what do I do with that knowledge? What is my seat? What is the privilege that I have? I can assure you that I'm deploying it every day. So ask yourselves those questions throughout every moment of your time. Always keep someone, Nikki alluded to humbleness. My dog is the one that keeps me humble. When she gives me that face and rolls her own eyes, I'm like, I know that I took a step too far. So congratulations again. You're going to be extremely successful, and I know that because you're in the room and you have this seat right now. Thank you very much.